I've been around long enough to know that life's got a way of throwing curveballs at you when you least expect it. You can work your whole life, give it everything you've got, and still find yourself getting blindsided by something you didn't see coming. That's the reality I'd learned over 37 years of working as a janitor at Northfield Enterprises. I didn't mind it none. I wasn't looking for fame or glory. I just wanted to do a good job, make an honest living, and keep my head down. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was a good one. I grew up in a small town where people understood the value of work. My folks always told me, don't expect much from the world, but give it your best every day. And that's what I did. I gave my best. I cleaned floors, took out the trash, and kept the place looking neat. I'd been at Northfield Enterprises for so long, I could walk the halls with my eyes closed. The building was like a second home to me. And the people who worked there, well, they weren't just co-workers. After all these years, I thought of a lot of them as family. But things started to change. Mr. Thomas Wright, the founder and CEO of Northfield Enterprises, had passed away suddenly. It shook me, as it did everyone else. He was the one who gave me the chance all those years ago when no one else would. He was the one who recognized that I had more to offer than just cleaning. He'd seen the loyalty I had to the company and had always treated me with respect, even though I was just the janitor. He'd always tell me, "Sam, you're worth more than you think." Those words stuck with me over the years, even when other people looked past me like I wasn't even there. After he passed, the company called in a new delegation to take control. I wasn't surprised. The man had no children, and Northfield Enterprises was too big to just let it slide. But what happened next? That threw me for a loop. See, I was used to new faces coming through, but this group, they were different. They weren't like the people I'd worked with before. They didn't seem to care about the people who had been with the company through thick and thin. They came in, all high and mighty, walking around like they owned the place. And maybe they did. I wasn't sure, but I figured they'd probably be around for a while. One morning, I was doing my regular routine, mopping the floors and keeping the hallways clean, when I noticed them. A delegation of new executives led by this tall, thin man named Richard Granger walked into the building. The moment they stepped through the door, you could feel the change in the air. There was an arrogance about them, like they didn't belong, but they sure thought they did. Granger had this smug smile on his face, like he was above everyone else, and it didn't take long for him to set his sights on me. I was just doing my job, mop in hand, head down. But something about the way Granger looked at me didn't sit right. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a lowly janitor, nothing more than a cog in the machine. I had seen that look before in the eyes of people who thought they were better than me. People who looked down on me because of the uniform I wore and the job I did. But I never let it get to me. I'd learned long ago to just let it roll off my back. But that day, he wasn't satisfied with just looking at me. He walked right up to me, slow and deliberate, like he was trying to show everyone around that he was in charge now. He had this self-important swagger in his step, like he owned the place. The whole room seemed to follow his lead, as if they all knew they were about to watch him make an example of someone. And guess who that someone was? Me. Granger stopped right in front of me, his eyes never leaving mine. For a second, I thought he was going to ask me something. Maybe a question about the building, or how long I'd been there. But no, he didn't ask nothing. He just pulled a half-eaten banana from his bag. The peel was yellow, and the fruit inside looked mushy, like it had been sitting around for too long. Without a word, he held it out in front of me, just staring at me like he was waiting for me to do something. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Was he going to offer me the banana? Or was he just trying to mess with me? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to let him have the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Then, with a quick flick of his wrist, Granger tossed the banana at my feet. It landed with a wet thud on the floor, and he said, almost smugly, "I'll let you eat this and clean it up, monkey." Now, in that moment, I could have done a lot of things. I could have yelled at him, told him off, maybe even thrown something back in his face. But something inside me told me not to. I'd been around long enough to know that sometimes you don't need to fight back to win. Sometimes it's better to just let the other person dig their own hole, and that's exactly what Granger had done. He didn't know it, but by insulting me, he'd already shown his true colors. He thought he could push me around, like I was some fool who didn't know any better. So I did what I always do. I bent down, picked up the banana, and tossed it in the trash. I didn't say a word, not a single word. The whole time, I stayed calm, kept my composure. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me react. I just did my job, like I always did. And let me tell you, that's when I knew something was off. You ever have that feeling in your gut, like you're standing at the edge of something, but you don't know what? I didn't know it then, but that moment, right there, was the start of a chain of events that was going to change everything. Granger had thrown that banana at me, thinking he could put me in my place. But little did he know, he wasn't the one in control. No, sir. That day, something was about to shift, and I had a feeling it had something to do with that little act of disrespect. After Granger had humiliated me with his little stunt, I went back to my work. I didn't let his taunts distract me, didn't let that moment break my stride. I still had a job to do, and that was all that mattered to me. But little did I know, there was something else going on behind the scenes that would soon turn everything I thought I knew upside down. I never had any illusions about the way the company saw me. I was the janitor, the one who cleaned up after everyone else. No one ever gave me a second thought. But what I didn't realize was that Mr. Thomas Wright, the man who had founded Northfield Enterprises, had seen something in me. He wasn't just the boss who hired me all those years ago. He was a man who understood people. He understood loyalty. And he understood that sometimes the people who get overlooked are the ones who carry the most weight, even if no one notices it. You see, Mr. Wright had made arrangements long before he passed, arrangements that no one knew about, least of all me. He had planned for the future, for the company's survival, and for someone to step up when he was gone. But it wasn't the usual suspects. It wasn't the high-level executives who had worked beside him all these years. No, it was me. I didn't know this at the time, of course. At that moment, I was still just the janitor, mop in hand, cleaning the same hallways I'd cleaned for decades. It wasn't until later that day that I learned the truth. As the hours passed, I went about my business, wiping down counters, emptying trash cans, making sure the office was spotless, like I always did. I didn't pay much attention to the new executives who were bustling around. They were talking amongst themselves in hushed voices, clearly more concerned with their new power than the people they were supposed to lead. They were focused on making their mark, and I was focused on doing my job, keeping my head down. But as I was finishing up in the main lobby, I noticed the office manager, Ms. Linda Hughes, walking toward me. She looked flustered, a file in her hands, her expression tense. She'd been with the company for years, and she was one of the few people who'd always treated me with respect. She wasn't one of the new crowd. She'd been around long enough to know the ins and outs of the company, and more importantly, she understood how things worked behind closed doors. She walked up to me, her brow furrowed in concern. "Sam," she said, voice low, "I need to speak with you for a moment." I nodded and followed her to the back office where she worked. She pushed the door open and motioned for me to sit. I didn't know what was going on, but something told me this wasn't just about cleaning supplies or maintenance issues. "I need to show you something," she said, holding up a folder that looked important. She opened it, and I saw a document that took me by surprise. At the top of the page was my name. Sam Harris, it read, in neat, official-looking letters. I didn't understand. What was my name doing on a document like this? I'd seen paperwork come across my desk before, but it had always been for work orders, scheduling, or maintenance requests. This wasn't like that. Ms. Hughes flipped the pages and I saw more. There were legal documents, financial records, and letters I couldn't make sense of. But what caught my attention most was the sealed envelope at the back of the folder. It was addressed to the board of directors of the Northfield Enterprises, and the name at the bottom of the letter was unmistakable, Thomas Wright. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Linda hesitated before answering, like she was unsure whether to tell me. "It's a will, Mr. Wright's will." I sat up straighter. The documents were laid out in front of me, but I couldn't make sense of them right away. But Linda explained it to me, slowly, carefully. Before Mr. Wright passed, she began, he made some arrangements that no one knew about. He knew he wouldn't be around forever, and he wanted to make sure Northfield Enterprises was in good hands. And he didn't leave it to the usual people, not to the executives or the management team. He left it to you, Sam. I couldn't believe it. My mind was reeling. How could that be? I was just a janitor. Mr. Wright had always been kind to me, but I never expected him to think of me like that. There had to be a mistake. I wasn't the one who should be in charge of the company. I was just the one who cleaned it. I couldn't be the one to lead Northfield Enterprises. But Linda was insistent. She showed me the letter, Mr. Wright's last will and testament, and sure enough, there it was in black and white. In the event of my passing, the will read. I leave the leadership of Northfield Enterprises to Samuel Harris for his loyalty and dedication to the company over the years. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I was speechless. I'd always worked hard, but I never imagined it would come to something like this. Mr. Wright had trusted me, believed in me. He had made the decision to give me control of the company, despite my position as the janitor. I sat there, stunned, as Linda explained the situation. She told me that the board of directors had no idea about the will, and neither did the new executives who had come in with their fancy ideas. They were all unaware that the company had already been handed over to me. It didn't sink in right away. I was still just the janitor to everyone else, but now I was something more. And though I didn't understand all the implications of it yet, something deep inside me told me this was the moment everything was about to change. The company that I had served so faithfully for 37 years was now mine, whether I was ready for it or not. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the world I'd known, the one where I'd been invisible to most people, wasn't the world that was about to shape my future anymore. It was time to step into the role I had. And the day had barely moved into the afternoon when it happened. I was finishing up my duties in the break room, making sure the counters were wiped down and the floors were spotless, as always. It felt like a typical day, despite the unsettling presence of the new leadership that had been hovering around the building. But it wasn't a typical day, not at all. I had just put away my cleaning supplies when Ms. Linda Hughes appeared again, this time looking even more rushed than before. She was holding a thick file in her hand, the corners of it wrinkled as if she had been flipping through it repeatedly. Her face, usually calm and collected, was now flushed with urgency. "Sam," she called out as she walked toward me, her voice low, but there was an edge to it. "You need to come with me. They're waiting for you in the meeting room." I paused, my heart skipped a beat. "Who's waiting for me?" I asked, confused. I didn't understand. The last thing I expected was to be called into a meeting room with the new executives, especially after the way Granger had treated me earlier. I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary since then. So, why would they want to see me? Linda looked at me with a kind of quiet seriousness I hadn't seen from her before. She motioned for me to follow her, and we quickly walked through the hallways toward the meeting room. As we passed, I saw some of the new employees and a few of the executives talking amongst themselves in hushed tones. They glanced up at us as we passed, their eyes flickering with curiosity, but none of them spoke. We reached the meeting room door, and Linda hesitated for a moment before opening it. I could hear voices inside, but they stopped as soon as we entered. The room was filled with some of the higher-ups from the company, a couple of executives I hadn't seen before, and a few others I didn't recognize at all. They all turned to look at me, and for a moment I felt the familiar weight of being the odd one out, the janitor, the one they didn't take seriously. I stood there in my cleaning uniform, my mop still in my hand, unsure of what was going on. Linda stepped aside, allowing me to enter, and then she closed the door softly behind us. "Sam, please," said one of the executives I didn't recognize. He was older, dressed in a sharp suit, and he had a kind of tense energy about him. "We've been waiting for you. Please sit." I was still confused, but took a seat at the conference table, the polished wood surface gleaming under the overhead lights. The room was silent for a moment, and all I could think was how out of place I felt. But I didn't have much time to think about it before the atmosphere in the room shifted. Linda placed the thick file in front of me, her hands trembling slightly. The faces around the table were unreadable, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Nobody seemed to want to say anything, so I just sat there, waiting, my fingers lightly tapping on the table. What was this about? What did they want with me now? Then, the man who had been the most vocal earlier, Richard Granger, spoke up. He stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, his usual smug demeanor now replaced with something more forced. "Samuel Harris," he said, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty. "We've just received some interesting news." I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. My mind raced. Had they found out about Mr. Wright's will? Was this some kind of joke or test? Had I somehow been caught up in a game I didn't understand? Granger paused and looked at the others in the room before continuing. "Apparently, Mr. Wright made some arrangements that no one knew about, and it turns out that—" He trailed off, his voice faltering just a bit. "It turns out that Northfield Enterprises has been left to you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It didn't make sense. I stared at him, waiting for him to explain himself, but there was no mistaking what he said. It felt like the room spun around me. "I beg your pardon?" I asked, my voice tight, though I still couldn't comprehend the gravity of what I was hearing. Linda, looking a bit apprehensive, pushed the file toward me. "Here," she said gently, her voice strained. "It's all in here. Mr. Wright's final instructions." I slowly reached out and opened the file, my fingers trembling as I unfolded the documents. There was the letter, the one with my name at the top, the one that said that Mr. Wright had left everything to me, a man who had worked his whole life in the background, cleaning up after everyone else. And now, here it was, in black and white, my name on the ownership papers for the company. The executives around the table shifted uncomfortably. Granger's face had gone from cocky to pale, and the tension was so thick I could almost taste it. No one knew what to say. For a moment, I was too stunned to react. Everything I had known, everything I had thought was true, had just been flipped on its head. The company that had once been a place where I swept the floors and cleaned up after others, the company that had always been just a job to me, was now mine. I was the one in charge. I looked up from the documents, meeting Granger's eyes, and I saw the panic beginning to set in. He wasn't the one in control anymore. He wasn't the one who held the power. "So," I said, trying to steady my breathing, "what does this mean?" The room was silent for a moment as the realization began to sink in for everyone. They had expected a puppet, someone they could control, someone who had always been beneath them. But that wasn't who was sitting at this table now. That wasn't the man who had just inherited everything Mr. Wright had worked for. Finally, Granger spoke again, his voice strained. "It means, Mr. Harris," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "that you're the one in charge now. The company is yours." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the moment beginning to settle over me. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer just a janitor, and I had a feeling things were about to get very interesting. Ever imagined I would hold. Time to step into something bigger than myself. The room was still. Every eye in it was glued to me, waiting for something. A reaction, a breakdown, maybe an outburst. It had been a whirlwind, a complete shock that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. A janitor, me, suddenly inheriting the company. It wasn't possible, not in 1,000 years. But there I was, standing in front of a table full of powerful men and women, the ones who had scoffed at me and looked down their noses at me for years. Richard Granger, the new leader of the delegation, stood there with his mouth hanging slightly open, his earlier smugness wiped clean from his face. The room was polished and professional, everything about it screamed corporate power. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in an instant. My old, familiar janitor's uniform felt like a costume now, out of place amidst the crisp suits and ties of the executives around me. They looked like they were trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of the situation. I took a breath, feeling the weight of their eyes on me as I stepped forward. Every inch of me was still trying to understand it, trying to believe it. But the documents in front of me were real. The papers were sealed with Mr. Wright's signature, his handwriting clear, the legal jargon unmistakable. I'd inherited Northfield Enterprises. This was happening, and there was no turning back. One of the younger executives, a woman with short blonde hair who I hadn't seen before, leaned forward and whispered to the person next to her. They were clearly trying to keep their composure, but their voices shook slightly. I could hear a mix of disbelief and panic in the room, and it made me feel both powerful and strangely out of place. The silence stretched on as I opened the thick file in front of me, my hands steady despite the rush of emotions I was feeling. Inside the file were more documents, the formal letter, the legal clauses, all of it pointing to one undeniable truth. Mr. Wright, the man I had worked for all these years, had trusted me, and somehow, in the middle of everything, he had seen something in me that none of these executives had. The letter that confirmed it all was short but clear. It stated that Mr. Wright had appointed me as the sole inheritor of the company. The ownership was mine. No one else could claim it, no one else could change it. His reasons, though not explicitly detailed, were embedded in a few lines of text that spoke of my dedication, my loyalty, and the kind of integrity I had shown over the years. There was no question in his mind that I was the one who should lead this place forward. I looked around the room, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. I had never asked for any of this, never expected it, but now it was mine, and I wasn't about to let anyone forget it. "Mr. Harris," one of the older executives finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly as he cleared his throat. We weren't aware of this arrangement." He shot a quick glance at Granger, who seemed to be recovering from his initial shock, but still looked unsettled. "Well," I said, looking at the group of them as I leaned forward just slightly. "Seems like Mr. Wright had faith in me. You'll have to take that up with him, I guess." I didn't mean to sound arrogant, but it came out that way, and I didn't care. There was something about seeing them struggle with the reality of the situation that felt satisfying. Granger, who had been standing by the window in a tense silence, turned slowly to face me. His face was pale, his usual cocky demeanor lost somewhere in the shuffle of the past few minutes. He tried to recover, but the cracks in his facade were clear. His attempt at professionalism seemed forced now. "Well, Mr. Harris," he said, still trying to hold on to some semblance of control, "I suppose we'll have to discuss the details of the transition." I nodded, finally standing up from the chair I had been occupying, still holding the papers from Mr. Wright. It wasn't lost on me that they were all looking to me now. A janitor, a man who had been cleaning their floors for decades, was now the owner of the company they had been scrambling to control, and they had no choice but to accept it. I glanced at Linda Hughes, who had entered the room with me, but had been standing in the back, quietly observing. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I knew that she at least understood what this meant. She had worked with Mr. Wright for years, and she knew better than anyone that he had always respected me for more than just my cleaning skills. The look on her face was supportive, though she kept her distance, knowing this moment wasn't about her. With a deep breath, I turned back to the group. "Well then, I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss, but first, I need to get a handle on everything. This isn't just about paperwork, it's about moving forward, and I don't plan on doing this alone." The room went quiet again. The tension was palpable, but something had shifted. They were waiting for me to take charge, to show them what I was made of. They had no idea what I was capable of. Not yet. Granger cleared his throat again and stepped forward, trying to reassert some control over the situation. "Of course, Mr. Harris. We'll provide whatever support you need. We just need to get the transition in motion." I gave him a small, cool smile. "Don't worry, I'll handle it." And just like that, the balance of power had shifted. They had no choice now but to follow my lead, whether they liked it or not. And as I stood there in that conference room, I realized one thing. I had earned this, not through power, not through money, but through years of hard work and integrity. It was my time now. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but it was clear. They knew who was in charge now, and it wasn't them. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Everything I had ever known, everything I had ever been taught, was in the process of being undone. As I stood at the head of that polished conference table, looking at the faces of the people who had once looked down on me, I felt a strange mix of triumph and disbelief. I had never asked for any of this, but here I was, the new face of Northfield Enterprises, the one they had to answer to now. The executives, Granger, the smug leader of the delegation, Linda Hughes, and a few others I didn't know, were still frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Their silence was deafening, like they were all waiting for someone to confirm that this was some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding that would be corrected. But there was no mistake. Mr. Wright's will was as clear as the day it was written. It had been left in my hands, and there was no going back. I sat down slowly, taking my time to absorb the enormity of what was happening. They had expected to walk into a company, a clean slate that they could control. They didn't expect a janitor to suddenly be the one in charge, and they certainly didn't expect me to be the one with the power. Granger cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice strained, "we're all in shock. We need to discuss next steps, how we proceed from here." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands across my chest. "Next steps," I repeated, almost amused. "I think that's for me to decide now, don't you?" The room fell silent again. The sound of my own voice seemed to echo louder than I intended. These were not the words they had been expecting to hear from someone like me. But I wasn't just some janitor anymore. I was the owner of Northfield Enterprises now, and they were going to have to adjust to that. I could see the unease in their faces. Linda Hughes, who had always been more of a quiet observer, was the first to speak up. "Sam," she said gently, trying to break the tension, We all understand this is a shock to everyone, but we're all here to help you transition into your new role. We want to make this process as smooth as possible." I didn't let her words sway me. I knew she meant well, but I also knew what kind of company this had been. They had overlooked me for decades, dismissing me as nothing more than the guy who cleaned their messes. But now, they were the ones in the mess, and it was my job to clean it up. I nodded slowly, but my next words came out with an edge. "Smooth, huh? Well, I think the first step is realizing that we don't get to decide how smooth this is. This is my company now, and I'll run it the way I see fit." I let that hang in the air for a moment, watching their reactions. Granger, always the one to try and maintain control, fumbled for a response. Of course. We'll work together. But we can't just ignore the reality of the situation. There's a lot at stake here." "A lot at stake?" I echoed, leaning forward, finally feeling the weight of the moment. "You've been running this company like it was your own playground, making decisions without a care about who was left behind. But now, it's on me, and I don't intend to follow the same paths you've taken." The look of shock on their faces was almost satisfying. For years I had been invisible to these people. I had been nothing but a man with a mop and a bucket, cleaning up after them, never acknowledged. Now, they couldn't escape me. They had to listen. They had to deal with me, and they had no idea what that meant. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Sam, we understand your frustration, but we're all on the same team here. We just need to move forward together." I shook my head. "No, Linda, you're not getting it. This isn't about moving forward together. This is about making sure that the people who think they can walk all over others understand that it's not going to happen anymore. That starts with you." I pointed directly at Granger, whose face was now visibly flushed. "You and the rest of the delegation might have had a plan when you walked in here, but that plan just hit a wall, and now it's time for you to figure out what comes next. Because from here on out, I'm the one calling the shots." I could see Granger's grip tightening on the armrests of his chair. His calm, collected demeanor was starting to crack, revealing the nervous executive beneath. The power had shifted, and now it was on him to navigate this mess. The rest of the room watched in stunned silence. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know what to do. And for the first time in a long while, I could see that they were scared. The kind of scared you get when you realize the rules you've lived by no longer apply. I stood up, slowly, deliberately, and looked around the room once more. "So here's the deal," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I'll need some time to assess the situation. I'm not going to make rash decisions, but I expect all of you to be on board. You'll report to me from now on. If you want to stick around, you'll need to prove your loyalty, not to me, but to this company, the company that I'm going to make great again." I turned and walked toward the door, my back straight, leaving behind a room full of executives who had no choice but to follow my lead. As I stepped out into the hallway, I couldn't help but think of how far I had come. A janitor, a man who had been overlooked and underappreciated for nearly 4 decades, now stood at the helm of one of the most powerful companies in the region.